Welcome to The Forgotten Soldier by Guy Sajer, a gripping and deeply personal story of a young soldier caught up in the chaos of the Eastern Front. These are his words. Let's begin. After a rushed, jolting journey, we re-entered Ukraine, where the ground had not yet entirely absorbed the spring runoff. There were long stretches of gluey mud, which we were able to cross only with great difficulty. The weather was beautiful, even hot, and we often stripped to the waist. On the road we received new orders. We were no longer to proceed to Vinnytsia. Instead, we were to re-establish communications between the rear and the front, which were continually harassed by partisans. We were ordered to annihilate these bands. Their attacks had grown increasingly virulent and often paralyzed the already uncertain flow of supplies. The Vinnytsia bridgehead had to be maintained as a starting point for new German offensives, which would break up the wedge the Russians had driven into Poland before Lvov and re-establish a connection with the north, which appeared to be holding. Our detachments, together with other units, had been given the job of engaging the partisans in a contest of ambush, in which the advantage belonged to whichever side surprised the other. Once again, the division was broken up. The largest section was sent to fight north of Lvov and in the northern sector of White Russia. Other units like ours were scattered throughout the rear areas of the south and central sectors before rejoining the division a few weeks later. Our zone of operations extended through Bessarabia as far as the Russian frontier. As before, we were a strong mobile unit designed to move quickly to the support of particular points in imminent danger. However, our mobility depended on the vehicles I have already described, which we gradually abandoned, continuing on horseback or on bicycles whose tires were often stuffed with grass. We requisitioned the horses, bicycles, and other vehicles from the thousands of refugees, Ukrainians, gypsies, Polish colonists, and others who were fleeing the red tide in a vast throng. Sometimes partisans infiltrated these crowds, posing as simple peasants who were also fleeing the Bolsheviks. Then, at a given moment, they would shoot some of our men in the back, sowing general confusion. These maneuvers were supposed to crack our self-control and provoke us to acts of reprisal, which would then turn the refugees against us. From their point of view, any means were justified. Toward the end of May, we trapped a large band of rebels in a piece of wooded country. There were about 400 heavily armed men. On our side, we had 3 companies to draw in the noose around the enemy. The air was filled with woodland smells, and nothing seemed appropriate to the bloody events about to occur. The morning was splendid. Birds and small animals of every kind were running and fluttering through the branches to get out of our way. Wild animals, even ferocious ones, always flee armed men. This time, the hunters were tracking far more dangerous game. The birds fearing and fleeing us could never have imagined that the masters of the world, who should have feared nothing, had created enemies of a size and ferocity which equaled their own. Human beings, rulers of the animal world, had created their own destruction, a process of natural selection, often very badly organized, periodically topples our crown. We all felt extremely nervous. Despite the resignation which had once again taken hold of us, the moment of truth as always revealed who was afraid, who was a coward, and who still hoped to live. The soft leaves brushing against our heads weighted down with steel reminded us that life could be good, especially in such marvelous weather. For us, this was no baptism of fire, but almost a routine, a dangerous routine in which medals for heroism were generally posthumous. We had already experienced most of its horrors and had seen the upturned eyes of those who had won the medals. There was no longer much we could learn about that aspect of things. We deliberately maintained an attitude of morbid fatalism, which we punctuated with bursts of harsh, forced laughter like machine gun fire. Some of the very strong had even managed to persuade themselves that since no man is immortal and everyone dies sooner or later, the hour of death was unimportant. Those men, the strong ones, walked along thinking of other things. Others, strong but not that strong, lived to delay that final moment, watching through pupils as dark as the holes at the ends of their gun barrels. The rest, which is to say the majority, were pouring with a cold sweat which ran down their bodies beneath their synthetic tunics into their boots, and into the creases of their damp hands. Those men were afraid, with an intense fear that reduced every conviction to nothing and which no routine could soften. They were afraid before every operation, when time seemed to stand almost still. Even those who managed to stop thinking were still assailed by fear, as persistent as the daylight, which illuminates treetops one is still unaware of. Contact with the enemy puts an end to this sort of fear. The opening shots raise the curtain on a drama which will fully occupy every sense. It is a pity that soldiers can think. When the first men have fallen, the tension slackens, and no one any longer pays attention to anything except the dry twigs crackling underfoot. Feldwebel Sperlovsky, who was leading our group, pointed to the signs of passage of a large number of men. The heavily trampled brush and the numerous empty gun emplacements indicated that we were approaching a large partisan camp. We had to watch carefully for mines, to watch each step in addition to everything else. Sweat trickled down our temples, attracting clouds of belligerent flies. The brush under the trees and the low branches offered 1,000 opportunities for concealed tripwires. Every yard required a desperate concentration. A plane passed over level with the treetops, and the throb of its engines made us all hold our breaths, for fear the vibrations might be enough to set off the whole area. At last, there was a short blast on the whistle, and we all fell flat. A small fort of logs driven deep into the ground stood at the end of a vague footpath. At the far end of our group, fighting had already begun. Sperlovsky designated 2 men, Ballers and Prince, to throw grenades at the fort. Prince was one of the men in Lenzin's Panzerfaust team. Today, however, the anti-tank group wasn't needed, so Prince was just another panzer grenadier, panting as he crawled forward with his lethal burden. Ballers, more dead than alive, was crawling along the other side of the path, identically laden. We all watched, trembling with tension. Who were Ballers and Prince? 2 men from anywhere. Were they good men or bad? Were they hateful? Was God with them, or had he condemned them? They were simply 2 men who had become our comrades in this group of madmen, men whose acquaintance we would probably have avoided in the ordinary circumstances of civilian life. Here, every step they took accelerated the beating of our hearts and keyed up our pulse rate to equal theirs. Those 2 anonymous beings, both of them our men, were suddenly more important to every one of us than even our closest relatives, an egotistical transformation in which we all knew that we saw ourselves. Had the circumstances fallen slightly differently, they would have been watching us. Motive seemed totally unimportant, if only they lived. They were already quite far from us and perhaps very close to death, hidden from many of us by leaves. I could still see them. Prince suddenly stood up and heaved his load toward the log fort. Then he plunged down again. The entire woods felt the violence of the explosion. Its thunder echoed interminably under the trees. In the patches of sky visible through the branches, we could see the birds shooting away from us like arrows. Prince's bundle had fallen short and had made a large crater crowned with broken branches some 7 or 8 meters from the partisan hideout. "Scheisse," muttered our sergeant. "There's nobody there," someone else said. Then I saw Ballers running forward in turn. As he ran, I felt myself dying in his shoes. He too threw his packet of explosives and then dived down as the trees all around us bent against a flash of light. The forest seemed to groan with the shock. This time there weren't any fleeing birds, only our mimetic uniforms, which confounded us with nature. Ballers had just stood up again, so had Prince, a short distance ahead of him. Their figures were sharply outlined against the broken earth. Behind them, all that had formerly been visible of the fort had disappeared. "This way, comrades," shouted Ballers, proud of his exploit. "There's nobody in there." We all stood up, prepared to join him. He was laughing nervously. A crisp detonation whistled through the leaves, followed by 2 more. Prince was running toward us, but Ballers wasn't. He was walking hesitantly, stretching one hand toward us. Then he fell. A short hour later, 400 partisans were fighting like devils inside the circle we had drawn around them and were slowly tightening. 3 companies almost at full strength, about 800 or 900 men, were trying to knock out the circle of fire, which was produced by a variety of weapons of every caliber and amounted to a serious destructive force. The partisan position was so well organized that any approach to it was almost suicidal. During this hour, 2 of our men stepped on mines, and their shattered bodies were blown into the budding branches. We were under uninterrupted fire from a 4-barreled machine gun, and setting up a Spandau was very risky. We tried to dig foxholes, but the earth was such a tangle of ineradicable roots that our position of attack was transformed into one of defense, which would be difficult to hold against an enemy breakout. Only our light mortars, with their almost vertical fire, could touch the enemy position. Unfortunately, the partisans seemed able to absorb our fire without any apparent loss of strength. 2 or 3 heavy howitzers, probably captured German equipment, were shooting at our encircling forces. The impact of the projectiles uprooted trees. The discharge of these guns was invisible, which made their destruction extremely difficult. 10 times we sent assault groups to attack the terrorist position. Each time they were obliged to make a half-turn, leaving some of their men screaming on the ground. Later we learned that West Radau had been moving heaven and earth to try to get some armored and motorized support, but none was available in that area, and we had to do without it. Everything that remained had been sent to the support of our crumbling front. After an hour of waiting and attempted assaults that came to nothing, our commander decided to risk everything once and for all. Leaving only a handful of isolated men in the ring around the fort, he shifted the rest of us, taking every precaution so that the enemy would believe they were still surrounded by a strong force. In this way, he was able to mass 500 men and send them all at once against the enemy's weakest point, a V-shaped trench held by 40 men armed with rifles and 1 machine gun. At his order, 500 men rushed the enemy position, attacking with grenade throwers. The enemy reeled under the force of this blow and was unable to maintain an accurate fire. 7 or 8 of our men fell during this assault, but the maneuver was so magnificent that for the moment no one paid much attention to them. I was part of the second wave. 2 others followed us. When we reached the enemy position, the job was already done. Some 40 partisans had tried to resist, but our rain of grenades annihilated 2/3 of them. The remainder had died on the bayonets of the first Germans to reach the fortress. We followed hard on their heels. Another wave was right behind us. The underbrush rang with hideous screams and smelled of powder and smoke and blood. I saw more partisans pouring from their log fort and firing point blank at our men, who were exhilarated by the success of our action. In the general confusion, I opened fire along with everyone else. A tall Russian fired at me 3 times without hitting me, although I made no effort to dodge him. Then he rushed at me, shouting and waving his gun, holding the butt in the air. 2 of our men joined me and fired at the Russian. He fell and tried to reload his gun, but we jumped him immediately, battering him with our butts. He died under our blows. At the foot of the blockhouse, a desperate hand-to-hand struggle was in progress. Something exploded in the midst of the fighting, sending shattered fragments of German and partisan bodies flying through the air. Other men ran up to continue the fighting, surrounded by the dead and dying. Cries and curses mingled with the sharp crack of rifle fire. A moment later, we were in the thick of the fighting. One of the fellows with me had his arm broken by an exploding mine. Pressed against the wooden wall, men were fighting hand-to-hand with knives, shovels, feet, and stones. An Obergefreiter had just hit a Russian in the face with his shovel, opening a hideous gash. The wounded man fell writhing to the ground. Kellerman was firing in short bursts at the partisans hidden behind the 2 howitzers which had given us so much trouble. Many Russians got away, at least half of them. Those who couldn't added to the numbers of the dead. We collected all the stray guns and reserves of food, destroyed the howitzers, which we couldn't take with us, and buried 70 of our men. Then we left the place, carrying out the wounded on stretchers made of branches. In the evening, we arrived at a kolkhoz, where we drank everything we could get hold of, trying to blot out the memory of a hideous day. Spring in Ukraine, endless days of almost unbroken light. A luminous darkness fell toward 11 at night, to yield to a pink dawn a few hours later. The weather was perfect, a warm, reviving wind before the crushing heat of summer. Unfortunately, although the season made us dream of peace, The monster of war was finally able to emerge from the paralysis of winter and the thaw. The pale blue sky belonged to the Russians, whose air power had grown enormously, the Luftwaffe, whose numbers had been seriously reduced by the necessity of defending German cities and dealing with the increasing demands of the Western Front, flew daily sorties which amounted to suicide flights against overwhelming enemy strength on the ground and in the air. Our few victories were the product of absolute heroism. The sky and the front belonged to the enemy. The rear areas were contested by two nearly equal opponents, the German army and the Partisans. We continually sent out patrols. Almost every sortie produced a clash. Every hill and hedge and cottage held a mine or hid an ambush. We had almost no vehicles of any kind, no gas, and no spare parts. We were also not receiving any fresh supplies. The odd, ill-assorted convoys still pressing through continuous air attacks were not destined for us, but for the faltering, collapsing front. When they arrived in the forward zone, they were able to find the correct units only by accident. More often than not, their cargoes were absorbed by the hordes of starving men retreating under a deluge of fire. We ourselves received at the greatest risk about a tenth of what we needed. We were obliged to live off the local inhabitants, who were very hard-pressed themselves and more than reluctant in their attitude toward us. The problem of food had become extremely serious. As it was spring, there were still very few fruits, and hunting was more dangerous for us than for the game. A small hamlet sheltered what remained of our 3 companies. Between operations, men slept almost naked on the ground. "Those who sleep dine," says the proverb. For us, it was vitally important that this become the reality. When planes came over, everyone took cover, and when they were gone, we laid our bony bodies out in the sun again. This helped to heal our winter louse bites. Half asleep, with our eyes half closed, we stared into the sky, apparently thinking of nothing. What was the use? We seemed to have broken completely with the past. Memories of peace floated up like fragments of books we might have read. The war had taught us to appreciate every minuscule good. Today, the sun took the place of our goulash and wurst and millet, and the mail which no longer came. We lay stretched on the Ukrainian soil, apparently calm and at peace. Tomorrow, perhaps, some food would arrive, and perhaps some gas and some spare parts, perhaps even some mail, a letter from Paula. But perhaps, too, there would only be ourselves and the earth and the sky and the sun. What was the use of thinking about it? One day, our radio crackled out an SOS from a territorial post on the Romanian frontier. It was surrounded by a band of partisans. In the eyes of the Wehrmacht, we were still officially considered part of a motorized unit standing by and therefore available. In consequence, we were always moving and had to be ready to leave at a moment's notice for points anywhere within a radius of 150 miles. The post calling us was some 100 miles away and had appealed to us because its officers had been told that in emergencies they could rely on our mobility. In fact, we had 4 trucks in bad condition, a small civilian van, a sidecar, and the CO's Steiner. Wes Rideout tore his hair and cursed. As quickly as possible, 100 of us left to answer the SOS. We took along as many automatic weapons as we could to make up for our small number. Each truck carried 2 Spandaus ready to fire. Above all else, we feared planes. We drove as quickly as we could along the terrible Russian roads, raising a thick cloud of dust. About 30 miles from our starting point, we hurtled through a village which could have belonged to prehistory. The inhabitants ran as fast as they could to get out of our way. We were bristling with weapons and black with dust, and we must have looked far from reassuring. As we left the village, a group of terrified residents scattered ahead of us. The Steiner went through, and then the first truck, which crushed a dog. The second truck bumped a black pig which ran out from nowhere and threw itself under the wheels. I was in the third truck and saw the whole sequence. The sudden braking ahead, the shrieking villagers running to the side of the road, the screaming pig dragging itself through the dust. 5 or 6 Lanzer jumped off the truck to chase the pig, trying to kill it as it squealed in agony. Finally, they stabbed it with their bayonets. It was still kicking, spattering its executioners with blood as they tied its feet with belts and ropes, and hung its 150 pounds from the tailgate of their truck. Then we started off again to catch up with the others, leaving the village in a squeal of gears. The pig, too, was soon covered with dust, which mingled with its streaming blood. We no longer objected to details like that. For those who survived, there would be fresh meat this evening. Sieg Heil. We were now driving through a strange landscape of smooth black hills, almost like enormous boulders, scattered with a few stunted trees. Wherever the ground was broken, the soil was black and seemed as hard as stone. I wished that I knew something of geology. Our route took us through this curious terrain for about 15 miles. We had just left that strange district when a group of planes was reported. One of our spotters confirmed that he had seen them through the treetops, slightly to our left. Our trucks pulled over to the side of the road, where they were screened by leaves. Wes Radau stared at the sky through his field glasses, but couldn't see anything. It seemed wise to wait for a few minutes. The Lanzer in the third truck put the time to good account, slitting open the pig and getting rid of its guts with lightning speed. As the job wasn't quite finished when we started out again, they finished it on the back of the truck. A few miles farther on, as we bumped through a chaotic landscape, 2 planes came over very low. We shouted at the drivers, who jammed on the brakes. There were no thick trees anywhere near us. As the planes passed directly overhead, we were all gripped by an insane, hopeless panic. Some men wet their pants. As the planes vanished into the distance, we lifted our heads and saw 2 Me-109Fs, which must have been the survivors of some squadron. No one thought of cheering the Luftwaffe. We had all been too afraid. Toward 4, we approached the zone of operations. Our trucks were following a winding track through mountainous country, driving very slowly for fear of ambush. Wes Radau's Steiner was in the lead. 2 observers, hunched on the hood, kept their eyes riveted on the dust along the way and on the heights surrounding us. Nothing we could see was in any way reassuring. Suddenly we were looking down into an open valley. We stopped, cutting off our engines, and immediately heard the distant sound of machine guns. Beyond all doubt, we had arrived. In the distance, through the heat haze, we could see what looked like a village. We kept the trucks 100 yards apart and maintained a moderate speed as the men clung on to the outside of the railings. Once again, our stomachs clenched at the approach of danger, and we wondered when we would begin to be adult men. Naturally, the enemy knew we were coming. The first truck suddenly saw the commander's Steiner driving backward at breakneck speed from a turn in the road. The vehicle was rolling down a slope when a sharp explosion burst on the track some 10 yards ahead of it. Everyone plunged to the ground and the trucks took whatever shelter they could. A second explosion tore a hole in the road, lifting a large cloud of dust. They were plastering us with shells from a 37mm gun. Then a burst of machine gun fire riddled the first truck. Luckily, everyone was already out. The driver must have watched in a cold sweat. The enemy was hidden by the undulations of the country and was very hard to see. Nonetheless, the men in the Steiner knew they'd been lucky. It was miraculous that the 37mm gun hidden behind the trees to the right of the turning hadn't opened fire the moment the Steiner appeared. The Partisans had felled a tree across the road right after the turn. We set up 2 light mortars and shelled the enemy gun, which soon fell silent. Probably amateurs, Wes Radau remarked. We deployed a dozen FMs, which made movement very difficult for the Partisans firing from the mountainside. Our group slid through the brush and climbed the first rocky outcrops, while our mortars rained a hail of projectiles, more terrifying than destructive, onto any point that seemed to harbor opposition. We had just uncovered an enemy post, real Johnny-come-latelys giving Fritz a hard time in order to reap a reward from their grateful country. "What bastards," muttered Prince to Smellens, "coming to shoot at us just for the hell of it. We'll fix them." Our group attacked the Partisans with grenade throwers. In that enclosed bowl of hills, the explosions made an overwhelming noise. Then someone raked the edges of the enemy ambush with a Spandau, which we recognized by the sound of its fire. After 2 more grenades, the apprentice sharpshooters were ready to give up. A figure ran out, attempting a desperate flight. He was quickly cut down by the Spandau. "What a bastard!" Prince shouted. "It's horrible to shoot down idiots like that. Why can't they stay home and wait until the war ends? For the love of God! If I was in their shoes, no one could twist my arm, and you'd be the same, wouldn't you, Sajer? Home. The thought went to my head like a gulp of wine. Home, to wait for the war to end. Yes, I said finally. And now we have to shoot them, he said. It's disgusting. We could hear plaintive cries from the enemy entrenchment. To our left, Spandaus and grenade throwers were destroying the tranquility of the spring. Suddenly, one of the Russian boys, in an excess of zeal, stood up, exposing half his body, and raked us with a burst of machine gun fire. His loose, approximate fire wounded one of our men in the right hand, and then another, undoubtedly on the ricochet in the calf. The Russian was shot down by our Spandau, while our wounded man began to groan in a shaded corner. "God damn it!" someone shouted. "Will you stop this bullshit?" Two figures climbed from the partisan position and without any apparent hurry began to run. Our FM sent them rolling in the dust, too. "Did you see that?" Smellin said to the gunner. "You just got a girl." "A girl? Are you sure? If women are getting mixed up in this mess now, that's the last straw." A few minutes later, we counted the bodies of the partisans, 6 young people about our age. Among them were 2 pretty girls bathed in blood and covered with a swarm of blue flies. We stared down at our victims, sickened by the sight. Why had they thrown themselves across the root of our misery? Their amateur barrier was quickly dismantled. We cleared the road and marched to the village. The trucks followed slowly behind us. Had the enemy been misinformed? Had they received exaggerated estimates of our minuscule capacity? Were they afraid? Whatever the reason, they abandoned their grip on the post which was almost theirs and came out to meet us. The sun was shining brightly on the narrow, dusty road. At the head of the column, our men were in contact with the enemy, who had taken refuge in the town cemetery. It was a typical Russian cemetery, blue and gold and white, with no suggestion of sadness about it. The day was perfect, the spring of late June turning into summer. We could almost have been fighting for a lark. Each plume of smoke was immediately carried away by a gentle breeze. We would certainly have been satisfied by a light exchange of fire, but our commander saw things differently. We couldn't let the enemy think we were too weak to attack, so our grenade throwers and light mortars destroyed the blue cemetery. 2 groups chased the partisans out and occupied the cemetery gardens. The partisans had taken refuge in a nearby wooden building where the crops were stored. On the door, the enemy had just daubed the Marxist slogan, "Workers of the World, Unite." This hasty scrawl, with dripping letters, gave a tearful impression of Marxist beliefs. To dispose as quickly as possible of this flimsy, improvised fortress, we loaded the Spandau with explosive incendiary bullets. The thatched roof caught on fire almost at once. The enemy, who were defending themselves with automatic weapons, did not spare their fire. A salvo of mortar shells knocked the roof into the building, and the partisans had to abandon an untenable position. Our 2 groups ran toward the burning building to harass the Russians as they fled. An old bearded man was leaning against a pile of stones, shouting curses at us. His right hand rested on the head of a dead comrade who lay on the ground beside him. The old man was wounded himself, and his clothes were torn and burned. We walked past him at a distance of no more than 3 yards. The sight of our guns didn't silence him. He shook his fist at us and cursed us. We all saw him through the smoke and sparks of the burning barn, but no one thought of shooting him. He showered maledictions at us until the collapse of the building buried him. A column of sparks rose into the azure sky. The first elements of our group were already in the village streets, firing on anything that moved. The last of the partisans were running toward the mountains. For a moment they were directly exposed to our fire, and we shot down 20 of them on the dusty road and among the junipers on the hillside. The Spandau, which had been fitted with a special magazine, took a horrible toll of the fleeing groups of partisans. Then we stopped firing, and the men from the German post came out and joined us. Many of them were wounded, and 12 were dead. We gave the wounded first aid and drove the local residents from their huts. Fires were spreading everywhere and had to be put out. Men, women, and children joined us in fighting the flames. It took almost an hour to put the fires out. Then everyone, ourselves included, dragged the bodies of the dead to a central point. Women screamed and cried as they recognized a husband or son or lover. It looked as if most of the partisans had lived in this place. Soon, however, the tears and sobs became threats and curses. We collected our own dead and wounded with the usual mute sentiment established by habit. The day was so beautiful it was hard to believe that any of this was really serious. Our eyes, disillusioned by so much accumulated fear and anxiety, no longer distinguished the tragedies of any particular moment. Hals was staring at the magnificent mountain scenery as he carried along a comrade whose tunic was blotched with brown stains. The birds had regained their sense of spring joy and were flying once again through the blue sky, which was faintly marked by smoke from the smoldering fires. For us, in the Eastern armies, this joyousness of nature almost excused what had just happened. After the mud and the cold, we were like wild animals, overjoyed by the spring sun and the knowledge that shelter for the night was no longer a serious problem. We deplored what had just happened as a disturbance of the peace and quiet we so much appreciated. The villagers were still caught in a crisis of tearful despair, and insults which were comprehensible simply by their tone shook our sense of well-being. Someone threw a stone, which hit one of our wounded men in the face. 2 lancers spun around, brandishing their machine guns. "Break it up, you pigs, or we'll drill you full of holes." But the shouted curses kept right on. We were ringed by faces, especially feminine faces, distorted by rage, spitting and cursing, and by shaking fists. Suddenly, 6 planes flying wing to wing appeared in that marvelous sky. 6 Soviet fighters looking for one of our convoys. This sign heartened the Russians, who shouted, "Aura Stalin," and pointed at the planes which blindly continued their search. We could see such hatred on all these faces that we shivered, despite the fine spring day. We were all thinking of our tortured, mutilated comrades, murdered by men who were mixing themselves into a fight that had left them on the sidelines. We remembered once again the tragic deaths at the territorial posts all along our line of retreat during the winter, faces smashed open with axes so that the gold teeth could be pulled out, the hideous agony of wounded men tied with their heads inside the gaping bellies of dead comrades, amputated genitals, Eller's section whom we had found tied up and naked, on a day when the temperature had dropped to 30 degrees below zero, with their feet thrust into a drinking trough which had frozen solid, and the faces of tortured men under the dark winter sky. With dry mouths, we listened to the mounting rage of these peasants, who were now paying a price they could have avoided for all time. If anyone had ordered us to fire, we would have obeyed without hesitation. I could see the gun shaking in the filthy, nervous hands of the man nearest me. A little way off, another of our men was no longer able to control the trembling of his face muscles. We had all stopped working, and our anger was rising like a storm. A tall, slim figure strode between the 2 groups. We saw that it was Wes Radau, and that he was white with fury. He stopped 5 yards from the Russians and threw them a look so terrible that silence fell at once. He had learned Russian during the long course of the campaign. He told the villagers to bury their dead with the same silence and respect he required of his troops. He said that the war would soon be over for them, and that they should wait for the end, keeping to the sidelines. He said that he had never imagined the war would bring him to shoot civilians who had been misled into arming by false propaganda, and excused himself for what he had been forced to do. Then his voice became as hard as death. He said that he would not tolerate any further hostile manifestations, that he intended to return to camp with all his men still alive, and that the entire village would be held responsible if he did not. Wes Radau's words had the effect of a soothing balm. Everything returned to a state of unexpected order. The dead were buried, and sobs were stifled. We found enough gas for our return in the stores of the outpost. The men there entertained us with a few bottles they had put aside several months before. Then we returned to the road, leaving 8 wounded men behind at the post, where the medical service would pick them up the next day. 6 others failed to answer the roll call and remained in the Ukrainian soil forever. "Not so crowded this time," someone said. We acquiesced without speaking. Our eyes lingered on the village disappearing behind clouds of dust raised by the trucks. The beautiful spring light glowed all around our blackened, steel-capped faces, which seemed irrevocably cut off from the season. Our awareness of everything was similarly split. Our thoughts, like our eyes, couldn't settle on anything that seemed definite or restful, and a sense of well-being had no place in the convoy. The whirling dust hid the bursting spring. All we could see were the trucks and the grotesque, dangling cadaver of the pig covered with blood and flies. The trucks lurched along the narrow mountain road, whose illogical course might have been traced by some wandering goat. Obstacles like stone outcrops were included without modification, and natural shaded ridges were avoided. Sometimes the track plunged into the bed of an unexpected stream or through a temporary pond. At other times we crossed deserts of dust, where the dryness seemed eternal. The truck slowly pursued the twists and turns, carrying us along, penned between the rattling railings. We seemed to be wandering endlessly toward new horizons on which we never had time to gaze, through an oversized, over-intense spring which would not allow us to forget that we were at war. Our expressionless faces stared at the spring with the unhappiness of paupers staring into a shop window decorated for Christmas. We too wanted the war to stop, and dreamed of peace, like the seriously ill, for whom the first sight of spring buds kindles a spark of life. But the fighting didn't stop. There was never more than a semblance of peace, and always someone to fan the flames of war. These people, on both sides, perhaps had perfectly good reasons for what they did. On that day, one of them crossed the road as we climbed up the long slope. He had seen us coming and quickly, perhaps inside of 10 minutes, laid his trap, hiding it in one of the dozens of potholes that pitted the surface. Then he hid, perhaps waiting to see what happened. Perhaps he too saw the yellow flash that tore apart our lead car. As always, there was a loud noise and a great deal of smoke climbing in black plumes toward the desperately smiling sky. 6 blood-stained men were slowly dying in the shadows of those plumes. The front of the Steyr was gone. The rest of the machine was knocked over onto its side. A few men pulled the victims from the flaming wreckage, while the rest assumed a defensive position. We laid Wes Radow and the 5 other occupants of the car against the bank of red earth. 2 of them were already dead. Another had a leg torn open in several places by metal fragments. His thigh looked like a millefeuille pastry. Wes Radow was covered with wounds, and his body seemed to be broken by multiple fractures. We did everything we could for him. The whole company thought of him as a friend. With everyone helping, we managed to bring him back to consciousness. Unlike everyone else we had watched, our captain did not have a face twisted by the revulsion or agony of death. His swollen face even managed to smile. We thought we had saved him. In a very weak voice, he spoke to us of our collective adventure, stressing our unity, which must hold in the face of everything to come. He pointed to one of his pockets, from which Feldwebel Sperlovsky pulled an envelope, undoubtedly addressed to his family. After that, for nearly a minute, we watched our chief die. Our faces, used to such spectacles, remained impassive, but the silence was terrible. We were able to save 2 of the men from the car, loading them carefully onto the vehicles which remained. Lieutenant Wohlers took command and organized a decent burial for our venerated leader. We walked past his grave one by one, saluting. We felt that we had just lost the man on whom the well-being of the whole company depended. We felt abandoned. That night we returned to the isolated village where our comrades were anxiously waiting for our return. The announcement of our commander's death provoked stupefied consternation. We were all in danger of death, but the annihilation of Wes Radow seemed as impossible to us as life without their parents seems to small children. We were prepared for every other death, but no one was ready to concede that fate for our leader. Guard duty that night seemed more uncertain than before. Our 3 companies seemed more vulnerable than ever. We all turned toward a source of strength which remained silent. Who would our new leader be? On whom would the destiny of our group depend? That concludes the 33rd part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.